Very good. Thank you, Matt. And good morning, everyone. Uh, we very much appreciate you joining us here today. I recognize a lot of the names on the call today as very talented, very experienced managers and board members. I'm sure that many of you have actually, I know that many of you have faced this challenge that we're going to discuss here today. That challenge of an association having to make their way towards very capital intensive projects, but with the lack of sufficient reserve funds to take on those projects. In light of your experience, your talent, by all means, feel free to add additional tips and tricks that you've learned over the years to the discussion. You could add those in the chat feature. You could add those in the Q&A. I'm sure you have some tips and tricks that could benefit all of us as well. My quick background, I'm a licensed professional engineer in several states, and I'm proud to have been a part of the success here at Reserve Advisors since 1999. But most importantly for today's discussion, is that I still very much enjoy visiting properties like yours each week to help with proactive capital project planning. So I've been through a lot of these discussions before. I've been through a lot of these very tough financial discussions where we're trying to help associations bridge a funding gap. First and foremost, if you're facing the challenge of having to bridge a funding gap, you're certainly not alone. 80% of associations are underfunded at the time of their initial reserve study. That's a lot. That's a huge percentage. So you're certainly not alone. Now, they could be underfunded because of financial limitations, or sometimes a board member simply having their head in the sand with respect to what projects are coming down the road. For those boards with their head in the sand, will that roof last longer or cost less if you pretend it's not coming down the road at you? Of course not. So how do associations navigate that challenge of bridging a funding gap? This is really where board members earn their big paychecks. Not an easy discussion, best out of our cocktails, because they can be really long, really tough conversations. So let's get this out of the way first. Let's get something very basic out of the way. A reserve study is often that initial guidance that boards can rely on to make informed decisions with respect to their financial planning, the projects coming down the road. But in a lot of cases where a funding gap develops, it's because of the lack of adherence to a reserve study. And I know that all of you know this, most of you know this, but a reserve study provides an independent opinion of the remaining useful lives of your property components, the cost to repair or replace those components, and the annual reserve contributions required to fund the projects if you were to try to fund the projects from reserves. So I have to note here, ideally, an association were to set aside appropriate reserve contributions all along, they may not have a gap that needs a bridge. They may not have to attend this webinar. Now, of course, we can't get the exact expenditures in the exact years. In fact, we'd be in a stock market if we could do that. The purpose of a reserve study is obviously not to get the exact expenditures in the exact years, because no board member, no manager, no engineer, nobody can do that. That ability for projects to move around, that's going to play a role in our discussion today. It's actually going to play a big role in our discussion today as we prioritize those different projects. You guys are going to think we made this up. We honestly did not make this up. This is actually a real example out there. Extremely rare for us to get opportunities like this. Extremely rare for us to get a case study like this. Two identical properties. They both came to us at the same time for their initial reserve study. They're identical buildings, construction materials, the age, the size, the footprint, all the same. Both built in 1980, and it was 2012 when they both came to us for that first reserve study. Both of them in 2012 faced some really tough financial decisions. Both were faced with a 60% increase in the annual reserve contribution. That's just a reserve contribution. There's other operating budget line items going up, of course, but just the reserve contribution, if they were to try to build their reserves to fund these projects, a massive increase was needed. Condo East, they made the difficult decision to increase the contributions to the appropriate level. Condo West, they only increased by 5%, so way below what was needed. And thus at Condo West, each year that went by, their reserve deficit got worse. The notes above are based on what the properties looked like at the time of the update. And you can see Condo East, so much better position, way better position, because they made that tough decision long ago. Kicking the can down the road, it can have some serious consequences and create some serious challenges when projects can no longer be deferred. What was evident at Condo West, in part, was this board paralysis that we see all the time. This board paralysis where they knew they had some big ticket projects coming up. They knew what the costs were for many of them. They agreed on the need for those projects, but they didn't want to raise their reserve contributions. They didn't want to special assess. They didn't want to take a loan. So they did nothing year after year after year. And it really created a major problem. We see that board paralysis all the time. And the mindset for today's discussion, and really all association financial discussions, I'd love to see people have in their heads here that the fiduciary responsibility of the board of directors is to maintain the investment of the owners. So as we go about trying to bridge this gap, each step of the way, you have to keep in mind the fiduciary responsibility is to maintain the investment of the owners. It's not to save people money. And I'm not saying you take the highest bidder, you don't consider costs, but at the end of every decision, you have to answer yes to maintain the investment of the owners. And incidentally, just personally myself, I think that's management's job as well, to maintain the investment of the owners. Again, real world example, believe it or not, we did not make this up. This is actually out there. So my approach, if you have a community that you're a board member at or a community that you manage where there's the need to bridge a funding gap, 3 initial actions. And I would argue that these are 3 most important steps and in this order. Now you could debate a little bit about flipping number 1, the project timelines and evaluating repair versus placement. You could make that argument to flip those 2, but certainly exploring the funding options as the 3rd step here. And we'll go into detail on all of these here in just a moment. But just a quick note, that repair word, evaluating repair, you could also kind of think of that as preventative maintenance. Preventative maintenance or repair to maximize the useful life of that component, to defer the need for that replacement. So let's get into some of the details here. Moving projects around, reevaluating the timing of those projects. I'm not big on this word discretionary, non-discretionary. I'm not big on those terms because in most reserve studies, just about all projects will have to occur at some point. Now, many of the projects we could debate all day the timing, and we probably all have different opinions of the timing on some of these projects, like the carpet, the hallway, the picture you see on the left. But at some point, they will have to occur. So I don't really like the word non-discretionary here, but let's just go with it. And I think it's important to note that this concept of moving projects around, it's not as easy as you think. It's not as easy as just moving projects out until the funding gets better. For example, these discretionary projects, you still have to take into account positive aesthetics, maintaining positive aesthetics for prospective buyers and owners. That's still part of maintaining the investment of the owners. Boards will often ask us to simply move projects out until the funding gets better. And it's not that easy. It's not that easy at all. In fact, my opinion, that's not maintaining the investment of the owners at that point if you're just arbitrarily moving projects out until the funding gets better. Again, these projects are going to have to take on at some point here, and you need to take them on in a timely manner. Board members and even managers far too often take this step of deferring projects way too lightly. Again, I'm trying to set the mindset here for this discussion here today. Just a quick story. I've had the pleasure of meeting and speaking with many of you, and I know you've heard this story before, but I think it's kind of powerful in light of boards simply trying to move projects out until the funding gets better. It was at a very contentious board meeting, very difficult financial situation where the board was trying to do that, trying to just move these non-discretionary, these important projects out. And they had their attorney there. And the attorney kind of had enough. And he said, stop catering to those who can't afford to live there and start catering to those who can. Now, I'm not brave enough to say that. but I thought that was pretty powerful. And that's a powerful mindset for today's discussion, catering to the people who can afford to live at your property. Now, I need a little disclaimer here because I had a person get upset with me one time. And he said, Todd, that's awfully rude of you to say, because at this management company, we care about our residents, unlike those other management companies in the city. Now, first of all, he missed I didn't say it. Second of all, I'm sure you care about your residents. Nobody wants to have that discussion about people not being able to live in their homes. That's a horrible discussion. But in my opinion, caring about your residents needs to include maintaining their investment. Many people, their home is their largest purchase. Maintaining that investment should be a top priority. So let's talk about moving some projects around. First of all, I'd strongly recommend not deferring projects where the cost increases as time goes by. In other words, masonry. Say you have masonry issues or stucco issues or EIFS issues, some type of facade issue. Each year that goes by, that crack, that small crack, gets a little bit bigger and costs a little bit more to repair when the time comes. Concrete, same story. Each year that goes by, that crack gets bigger, maybe some more spalling develops, and it costs more to repair when time goes by. So there's a risk involved in deferring projects where the conditions will continue to deteriorate or the rate of deterioration can accelerate as you end up costing yourself more money when you do get around to the project. The idea is to fix some of these issues before the small stuff becomes big stuff, before you get leaks into units, for example. Roofing is another one, whereas deferral of a roofing project could result in water infiltration or could result in damage to substrate materials like insulation or sheathing. So there is a risk involved with deferring these critical projects, facades, roofing. Just to show prioritization of projects in a table form, the projects we highlight in red probably should not be deferred. Roofing systems, increased potential leaks. You see life safety system there at the very bottom. Oops, my life safety system at the very bottom. Like probably shouldn't be deferring life safety projects. But I think a major overall note here is before you start moving projects around, you need to know where your low point is in your cash flow first. We'll talk about that in more detail in a moment. But moving projects around prior to that low point may not help much. And my point here being that just looking at the expenditures does not give you the entire picture. You need to understand your cash flow as well to understand which projects are going to make the difference in that cash flow and really help you out when trying to bridge that gap. So some of the projects, like you see mailboxes there highlighted in green, it's probably okay to move the mailboxes. But does it even really matter? Would it even make a difference in your funding plan? That's a key consideration here. Kind of a basic slide here, but I think it kind of tells, provides a little bit of guidance when it comes to moving projects around. So that first consideration should be if the project impacts structural integrity. It's a critical consideration here. Obviously, structural integrity, maintaining the safety of your owners is a key consideration as a board member. Projects that maintain structural integrity, of course, they should be prioritized. But mentioned earlier on that other slide, does moving the project even make a difference? Because some do, some don't. This is where knowing where your low point in your cash flow comes in. Moving projects around prior to that low point may not even make a difference. And yet we see it all the time. People trying to move projects that don't have a sufficient size to make a difference. We get requests from boards to move a bunch of projects, often prior to that low point, some of them quite small. We move them around for them, and then they're surprised that nothing changed. Well, because they didn't understand that concept of the low point in their cash flow. We'll show that on a table form in a moment here to make that a little more clear. But again, back to the discretionary projects, light fixtures, hallway renovations, you still have to maintain positive aesthetics for owners and prospective buyers. So there's a limit to how far we can move those out. If I'm a board member of a property, I'm in a tough financial spot, of course I'm going to think about moving those projects. But there is a limit to that. We still have to take on those projects. So we're going to move to evaluating that concept of repair versus replacement. Can we extend the remaining useful life? Can we defer the need for replacement? Now, keep in mind that in most cases, it's not reasonable to think that you can defer the need for replacement indefinitely or for an extended period of time. Now, each component is a little bit of different discussion on this topic. But if you are lucky enough to put some do repairs to defer the need for replacement, probably shouldn't have in your head 10 more years, 2, 3, 4, 5 if you're lucky, but it still needs to stay on your radar screen. You're not deferring this to the point where you can pull it off of your radar screen. So a couple examples to hit upon here. Flat membrane roofing. This is one where I believe, my experience, preventative maintenance can defer that need for total replacement. But the game that's played is to replace that roof system prior to leaks into units or prior to damage to the substrate materials like insulation. If you saturate that insulation, did you possibly cost yourself the ability to overlay that roof? And now you're forced to a tear off. So I do believe preventative maintenance on flat roof systems can be quite helpful, but you still got to play that game. You still got to play that game of replacing it in a timely manner. Same discussion with the middle picture, asphalt pavement. My opinion, asphalt pavement, patching, crack repair, as long as it's thorough, as long as it's timely, that's key. Can't wait too long to get to it. I think you can defer the need for that major repaving event. And part of that discussion with pavement, how much deterioration can you live with? If it's quite cracked, lots of cracks, maybe some potholes here and there, can you live with it? Can your community live with it while you get to other big projects? That's a consideration. But the game with asphalt pavement, if you wait too long, is it in too bad of shape to mill and overlay? Do you now have to total replace that pavement? So love the idea of timely repairs to maximize that useful life, but you got to still keep total replacement somewhere on your mind. Mechanical equipment is kind of an interesting discussion because oftentimes it works or it doesn't work. Kind of black and white. That preventative maintenance to your mechanical equipment, especially timely and early on, that can really help to maximize the useful life of that mechanical equipment. But let's take boilers, for example. There's other considerations sometimes, other than just does it work or does not work. That picture, that's an kind of old school boiler. Boilers nowadays much more energy efficient. We see a lot of communities faced with this discussion of, okay, we have an older boiler. We have somebody good who knows how to maintain it. We're doing a good job maintaining it. It works fine. But replacement with more energy efficient boilers has a payback period to it. And the payback period's not all that long. So why don't we think about replacing those boilers, taking on that capital intensive project with the understanding that that payback period is not that far down the road. That's a challenging discussion in a lot of properties, especially when, again, boiler works. Why replace it? Sometimes that energy efficiency discussion can come into play. It's important to note that sometimes there's an increase in the overall cost to an association when taking this approach, when taking that approach of let's maintain it to push out that remaining useful life. Depending on what part of the country you live in, depending on what type of roof system you have, roof costs have gone up significantly and continue to go up significantly. So that deferral could end up raising that roof cost quite significantly. In this particular case, this association, they put $100,000 into their roof and they're hoping to buy them 3 years. That's probably pretty reasonable. I kind of like that initial approach. But sometimes it's best to simply get the project done, which may mean in this case, if they have a gap to bridge, maybe using means other than reserves to fund the project. Like that $100,000 that you put into the roof to defer the total replacement, that's 10% of the overall cost. That's 10% that could have gone towards that replacement project. And again, it's not realistic to think that that $100,000 repair gets you a bunch more years. It maybe gets you a few more, like 3 in this case, but I would not bank on several more years. Keep thinking about how you're going to fund that replacement. Now, I'm going to contradict myself just a little bit from that last slide. If preventative maintenance is applied in small amounts each year, it's kind of all along, you're often able to maximize that useful life, and the outcome is a reduced overall cost to the association. I have this kind of basic example here. I should really change this example to demonstrate the savings over time a little bit better. But in this case, they applied a little bit of maintenance each year, stayed on top of it, and it maximized that useful life. Some of these projects, a reduced useful life is a major problem. Roofing, you don't want to reduce that useful life. So we went through moving projects around. We went through the idea of repairing components to defer the need for replacement of that project. Now we're going to get to that step 3, the funding options. And this is really likely the most controversial and challenging discussion. These are the tough ones here. I'm sure everyone on this call, actually, I know many of you have been through a lot of these discussions. How are we going to plan for our big ticket projects? You got 3 ways to pay for these projects: reserves, loans, and special assessments. I think it's a key note here. Owners have to pick one. The problem owners are the ones who don't want to do any of it. Believe it or not, I'm not here to push one method over the other. I'm just here to help you make informed decisions here. So there's pros and cons to all of these methods here. And those question marks, we're going to fill in as we go through the examples and see what the results are. The idea of funding your reserves appropriate annual reserve contributions, is that everyone pays for the use. They pay for the use of the association maintained components each year they live there. Each year they live in their unit, that roof weathers and ages 1 year, and you want to make sure people pay for that use. I had a board president at an annual meeting explaining this to his owners. This was a high-rise with elevators, and he explained it as, it's like putting a little change box outside the elevator. So every time you want to use that elevator, you need to put a little bit of money in that change box. So when time comes to replace the controls, the money's there. I like that. I'm going to steal that. So it's paying for the use, not setting aside money for a project way down the road where you may or may not live there to see the project actually occur. You're paying for the use. That's a key concept in these discussions. And yet, as you guys all know, and probably many of you on this call, you're going to have people on all sides of that argument. You're going to have people who buy into that, pay for the use, raise your reserve contributions appropriately, but you're also going to have the other side who say, you know what, board needs money. I'll be the first guy to write you a check. But I don't want to set aside money for a project that's way down the road where I may or may not live there to see the project actually occur. Besides, I can manage my money better than the board can, so I'm not giving you my money till you need it. In fact, some of you have heard this story, happened very early on in my career. An old guy in Florida told me, you know what? I'll be dead 5 years from now. That's my kid's problem to figure out how to pay for the roofs. Look, I get it. I understand it. Today's discussion, let's bridge that gap. We have a funding gap. Let's bridge it. What are our options here? So let's go through these 3 options here. First of all, don't worry about memorizing these numbers. I'm going to summarize this in a nice table here at the end. We'll be able to compare them all together a lot easier. So in this scenario, this board decided that they want to increase their annual reserve contributions to pay for projects that are upcoming. This scenario, this board, special assessments, loans, those are bad words to this board. They want to avoid those at all costs. So they would rather increase their annual reserve contributions. If you see at the bottom, you see that 2032 balance circled in red. So that's that critical year. Remember earlier I spoke about knowing where your critical year is. And if you look at the graph in the upper right corner, that blue line represents your reserve balances over time. And right about that 2032 mark, you see how it dips way down. That's a critical year. That's a low point in your cash flow. So to bridge the gap at this community, yes, we've got big stuff in the near term, but we really got to get through 2032. Like we got to get past 2032. That's the challenge. We got to get through this low point. We got to battle our way through that low point. So this is where I mentioned moving projects around prior to that low point probably doesn't help you. You probably got to get something past that low point, past 2032, then you're in business. And one of the things associations always want to do is they want to phase a project. Let's phase the project. Let's do it over a number of years. Well, if you phase that project past 2032, yeah, you're gonna help. You're in business past your low point. But if you're just phasing a project prior to that low point, you could be costing yourself money. You could be cheating that contractor out of the ability to give you the lowest unit cost for the work. You could be paying for mobilization over and over and over again. Extending a project over a number of years is not always the answer. It's not always a positive. And yet it's what everybody goes to. So scenario number one, we raised our reserve contributions to avoid special assessments and loans. Let's go to scenario number two. Now, if you look down at the bottom, the reserve funding plan, you see a red line special assessment income for the roofing in the near term, 2028. So this association, this board, they decided to levy a special assessment, in this case for their roofing, to bring in some extra income. And their idea is they want to keep their fees lower. They want to avoid an increase in their annual fees. Maybe to help with the perception the prospective buyers have that hey, our fees are too high. People aren't going to want to buy units here. So I just want to make one note to that here. It's difficult to find apples to apples comparisons. When you're comparing fees to your neighbors, you need to know a lot of information. Every community is going to be a little bit different in what they're going to need to put away. And you need to know if that fee that they're paying at your neighbors, is it good? Are they on a good path? Or are they heading towards a major assessment because it's too low? And a board member asked me, hey, can you, without giving names of the properties, can you show me a handful of properties in our neighborhood, what their annual reserve contributions are? And as I was putting that together, I quickly realized this doesn't tell the whole story. Like this board member is going to see a neighbor of similar age and construction with a much lower fee. But what he's not getting is that fee has been way too low for too long. And although they're keeping their fees low, they're headed towards a massive special assessment. So I know everybody wants to compare their fees to their neighbors, but it's really, really hard to find an apples to apples comparison because there's so many variables that go into determining how much to put away, how much to have in reserves, or what their annual reserve contributions should be. So this scenario, they brought in additional income for a special assessment to keep their fees down. So let's go to that third scenario, that third funding option, use of a loan. So this board decided they're going to use a loan to bridge that gap. And I'm starting with the expenditures page here first. If you see at the very bottom, you see loan payments. So they're going to fund they're going to take out a loan and they're going to fund the loan payments from reserves. It's key to determine how you're going to fund the loan payments. Obviously, right? Kind of a dumb comment, right? But actually, that's one of the biggest mistakes we see associations make, is they fund their loan payments from reserves, but they do that without calculating the payments into their reserve study, into the reserve contribution calculations. In fact, some of the worst financial situations I've ever seen are situations where loan payments eat up the reserve contribution. In other words, A lot of that reserve contribution, most, sometimes darn close to all, are going towards loan payments for previous projects, and there's very little money going towards future repair and replacement. That never goes well, and it's some of the worst financial situations I have ever seen. So just show you that loan proceeds going in. So the previous scenario, that special assessment, we showed income for special assessment money coming in. Now we see the loan proceeds coming in to help with these projects. Again, to keep those annual fees, those annual reserve contributions down. So just to show you, I just want to, just in general, just for comparison, and again, we'll talk details here in just a moment, but I put all three scenarios together here to show that the blue line, your reserve balances over time, they all look pretty similar, don't they? Each community has to get through that low point about 2032, that dip, that big dip in their blue line. Now, they all got to a similar cash flow through a different route. First route, they increased their reserve contributions. The one in the middle, they special assessed. And the one on the right, they used the loan. So you see their loan proceeds coming in. So now let's go to maybe the most important slide in the entire presentation, the results. How'd that all work out? So I'm going to go to the very bottom, the loans first. As you probably guessed, we got a lot of smart people on this call. You could have probably guessed that the loan use of the loan ended up as the highest cost to the unit owners over time, in part because of the interest, right? No, don't get me wrong here. Loans are still a very good option to get projects done in a timely manner and to spread out those costs. So, we see loans used successfully all the time. It is certainly a good option. It does add to the cost per unit over time. What's interesting here is that the reserve increases, that association increased the reserves, and the association decided to bring in the special assessment income. They came out the same over time, over an extended period of time. Now, near term, yes, if you look just near term, it's different. It's more towards the special assessment. But long term, it came out the same. So it goes back to what you would prefer. Are you an association who wants to keep your fees low, keep those fees down? Or are you an association who, hey, let's special assess, let's just get this over with, bring in the income? There's some pros and cons there too, as we talked about with that concept of use, paying for the use each year you live there. That special assessment, you're hitting the current owners. You're going to get hitting the current owners. Unfortunately, the people that moved out prior to that project will have gotten off without paying their fair share. I have to say here that ideally, this association would have set aside appropriate reserves from the very beginning, and then they wouldn't even have a gap to bridge. They wouldn't even need to attend this webinar. So it's going to be important that whatever scenario you use to get through this gap in the near term, it'll be important for your community to end up on a better path in the future as you move forward that avoids additional gaps. Love to see associations who are going through tough times now, when they get through those tough times, be on a much better path that avoids those tough times in the future. So those three steps, that reevaluating project timelines. Again, we see boards and managers move projects around way too lightly. And you still need to consider maintaining the investment of the owners when you move projects around. Moving projects around just for the sake of keeping your fees down, avoiding special assessments, avoiding loans, probably not maintain the investment of the owners. You probably got to take on some of those projects and figure out how you're going to take them on. Next step, that repair. Can we repair the component instead of replacement, or to defer replacement? Shouldn't have said the word instead there. Certainly can help. Timely repairs, timely preventive maintenance can certainly help defer those replacements. But I want to make sure that you guys keep these projects on your radar screen. Keep thinking about how you're going to fund them, because it's not realistic in almost every case to think you're going to get a whole lot of years more out of it. And then finally, consider all of your funding options. You have those three ways to pay for projects: reserves, loans, special assessments, or a combination of those. Look at your funding options after you have the projects where you think they should land, after you've determined which projects you can defer through repairs. Now you look at your funding options and keep all of those on the table, is my opinion. So a few key takeaways here. And I think it's important to note that associations that we see do very well, they do three things. They kept up with their preventative maintenance, they kept their reserve study up to date, and maybe most importantly, they tried their best. They tried their best to get as close to that annual reserve contribution as they possibly could. We see associations who do those three things do really well, even through the pandemic, even through the super high inflation, super high construction costs. Associations that did those three things made it through in pretty good shape. I'd love to see your communities work with your reserve state provider. If it's us or somebody else, work with that provider. That may include meeting with the board and even ownership to talk through these challenging situations. Allow your reserve state provider to help facilitate some of those challenging discussions. That working with your reserve state provider, it may also include working with them to develop various funding scenarios to help you lay out your options. Your reserve state provider can help with that. Your reserve state provider can, in most cases, provide you with an Excel or some version of your tables that help you model as well. Again, use your reserve state provider as a partner, as a long-term partner.